The worst day on Wall Street since the crash of
The
1987.
Dow traders are standing there watching in amazement, and I don't blame them.
We're now down 43%.
Almost everything there completely wiped out. And the NASDAQ, everything and more has been completely wiped out.
Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate.
So what caused the financial crisis? When looking at the financial crisis and the Great Recession, there are lots of areas where prediction fits in, from things as simple as the higher likelihood of default with subprime borrowers to the levered losses problem and the effects of an asset bubble pop on an economy. In their book, House of Debt, Mian and Sufi focus on the problems with leverage. Their research shows that economic disasters are almost always preceded by a large increase in household debt. When looking back to the Great Depression, calculations by Charles Persons suggest that outstanding mortgages for urban non-farm properties tripled from 1920 to 1929. International data referencing the years preceding the financial crisis show an increase in the household leverage ratio for 16 countries, including the US. Additionally, it is evident that house prices increased dramatically in these various countries. This far exceeded the growth in disposable incomes over the same period, showing that housing bubbles were widespread. The two exceptions where house prices fell in this period, Japan and Germany, had previously experienced large run-ups in house prices during the late 1980s and early 1990s. When combining the two previous data sets together, it becomes evident that countries with the largest increases in household leverage from 1997 to 2007 also tended to experience the fastest rise in house prices over the same period, and countries experiencing the largest increases in household leverage before the crisis tended to experience the most severe recessions, where severity is measured by the percentage decline in real consumption from the second quarter of 2008 to the first quarter of 2009. Contrary to what some people think, mortgages were pooled into mortgage-backed securities before the early 2000s. Government-sponsored enterprises would buy mortgages from banks and package them into tradable assets called a mortgage-backed security. The mortgages that went into these were strictly prime, and there were lots of regulations as these enterprises were connected, while not entirely, to the government. Securitization is the process of turning an asset, like a loan, into a marketable security. So in the case of mortgages, many individual loans were packaged together into a mortgage-backed security. The income streams coming from the mortgages were what essentially paid the bondholders, and the reason for pooling the mortgages together was to reduce default risk through diversification. Starting in the early 2000s, the private market for securitization took off, and this market had much less regulation. The private label MBS market, through its tranching mechanism and lack of regulation, opened up the market for subprime borrowing. The MBSs included large numbers of non-prime loans, but were composed of a diversified set of mortgages so that this in theory should have reduced risk. They were then split up into levels, tranches, that represented different riskiness, the least risky being AAA rated going down to B. The idea was that income streams coming in would go to the AAA rated bondholders first, and then work down the tranches, so that B rated tranches had the most risk and AAA were almost risk-free. The models, however, were fundamentally flawed. They underestimated the probability that multiple borrowers would default on their loans simultaneously. The securitizers vastly underestimated the likelihood of default and the correlation of those defaults. This is where we start to see the accuracy of predictions going awry. These bets were made based on inaccurate assumptions. Banks were much less careful investigating low documentation borrowers when they would sell the mortgages into a securitization pool. The conclusion is clear. Securitization lowered the incentives of banks to screen and monitor borrowers. These lower standards and inaccurate assumptions, fueling demand for more seemingly safe bets, opened up the gates for subprime borrowers with easier access to credit. When people started to default on their loans and go into foreclosure, house prices were pushed lower and lower. This caused more borrowers to go underwater on their mortgage and foreclose, creating a vicious cycle. Prior to the crisis, the economy predicted that nationwide defaults were unlikely, and this proved disastrous. Tons of seemingly safe assets were created, attracting capital from around the world. When these assets turned out to be full of risk, financial markets collapsed. A great measure of risk and uncertainty in financial markets is the LIBOR-OIS spread. LIBOR is essentially the rate at which banks can lend to each other overnight, and OIS can be thought of as a measure of safety. So when this spread gets large, it indicates more risk and uncertainty. When looking at the spreads during the financial crisis, there are large spikes, especially around the failure of Lehman Brothers. These types of spikes are good predictors for turmoil in financial markets.
Fear spread in the month of September 2008 at a rate that was like a tsunami.
Lehman, like so many other investment banks and banks, really got, quite frankly, caught up in the housing bubble. But like every bubble, the bubble ended, and now we're seeing the downside of that bubble.
Following the same risky practices that sunk former giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, Lehman also had a hand in securing America's high-risk subprime mortgages, believing that the popularity and sheer volume of those loans would net huge gains. But it didn't. Borrowers saturated the U.S. housing market, taking on enormous mortgages in spite of poor credit history. As the economy cooled, Americans found themselves with less cash to spend.